You're listening to The Russell Moore Show, and here at The Russell Moore Show, we bring you conversations to help you navigate Christian faith in confusing times. Through the next several weeks, we've highlighted some specific conversations that revolve around themes in Russell Moore's newest book, Losing Our Religion, an altar call for evangelical America. It's a book that Publishers Weekly says will buoy disillusioned hearts and minds. Losing Our Religion is available now wherever you buy your books. So if you're feeling disillusioned and looking for clear-eyed gospel hope, we hope you enjoy these upcoming conversations. And today, Russell sits down with Karen Swallow Prior. She's the author of The Evangelical Imagination, and you'll find a ton of crossovers between Karen Prior's work and Russell Moore's. To whet your appetite, listen in to this little bit from Losing Our Religion. Russell writes, "We are now seeing young evangelicals walking away from evangelicalism not because they do not believe what the church teaches, but because they believe the church itself does not believe what the church teaches. And more than that, many have concluded that the church itself is a moral problem. Well, what can be done?" Listen in to this conversation with Karen Swallow Prior as Russell and Karen chat about what does it look like to retrieve and leave parts of an evangelical imagination. Listen in.
I have been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. Have with us on the show today Karen Swallow Prior, the notorious KSP, who has written a fascinating new book called The Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. It's a really interesting book, and it's wide-ranging. It goes through a lot of different things that explain the church situation, but also the broader sort of cultural situation as well. Karen, welcome to the Russell Moore Show.
It's great to be with you, Ross. Thank you.
I was having some audio problems here. I remember once when you were at an event of ours, I believe, in Nashville, you were literally hit by a bus. So I hope that it's not a curse on our conversation today.
I hope the curse breaks one of these days.
I remember telling someone about that after you were okay and everything was going on, and there came a point where I had to say, no, I'm not saying metaphorically. I'm saying she was genuinely hit by a physical bus and survived, and no worse for wear. Karen, in this book, I want to go through several of the things that you talk about, but close to the end, you say that you were having a conversation with a disillusioned evangelical, and the person asked you, people ask me all the time, why are you still a Christian? How are you still a Christian? And your answer was really interesting to me, because you said that you're not sure you would be if you had grown up after you did in terms of the Christian culture. And I wondered about that because I thought, I remember 1980s evangelicalism with the Chick tracts, which you mentioned. I also had the fear of having my whole life shown as a movie to everyone. Hal Lindsey books and prophecy conferences. Carmen. There were all kinds of things going on in 80s evangelicalism too. So why do you think it would be different for you later?
Yeah, we're really digging into the heart of it here. And my book is about 300 years of evangelical history, but that history is what brought us to this moment in history. I'm old enough, even though I was exposed to those things in the evangelical, what was then a subculture. I think really now it is more than a subculture. I was exposed to those things, but that wasn't my world. I wasn't brought up within purity culture. I wasn't brought up to think that I had to, follow this certain formula, or I wasn't a good Christian. I was surrounded by good Christian parents, had wonderful pastors in small rural churches, didn't like youth group, but that was optional. And so it wasn't until, I think we all lived through this moment. I lived through it as a professor teaching young people who had grown up in this very legalistic subculture that tied the culture to Christianity in a way that didn't distinguish between the two. And I understand their disillusionment. I understand their deconstruction, because so much of what is cultural has been presented to them as Christian. And when they discover that there's a difference, they think it's all a lie.
How did your parents know not to veer into that sort of legalism and authoritarianism?
That's a really good question that I haven't thought about. They became committed Christians when I was a young child. So even though my mom grew up they both grew up in New England, my father's family was more secular, agnostic, not religious, and my mother grew up in sort of old-time Methodist churches, a Methodist church. It's still there, actually, in rural Maine. But they came to a serious faith commitment when I was already a small child. And I think that for them, their faith was real too. It wasn't cultural. And so they just, didn't have any reason to enculturate me in that. We just had our Christian faith and our work and our community, and we just weren't part of that culture. And of course, the evangelical industrial complex wasn't around, the media wasn't as pervasive, and so we were really just sort of living in our real communities and our real church, and weren't marketed to the way Christians are today.
Yeah, I think you may have been in a more idyllic place than I was, because I was marketed to plenty during the 1980s. But I do think some things have shifted. What do you say to people who would say, well, evangelicalism has always just been a prop for misogyny, racism, militarism? That's what it is. And it has always been simply that. And the theology is just a front. The subculture is just a front. What would you say to somebody who's come to that conclusion?
Well, I would say two things, and two things can be true. I would say that a lot of that thinking and that idea fails to recognize that the evangelical movement goes back 300 years, that it began in 18th century England as the evangelical revival and as the Great Awakening in America. And its impetus was very much other things that many church historians have talked about, I talk about in the introduction to my book. Yeah, in as much as 18th century England and 18th century America were misogynistic and racist as cultures, as societies, then evangelicalism did not necessarily or very well distinguish itself from the culture. So it arose in a culture that was those things, but the origins were very much about specific expressions of Christianity, beliefs about the Bible, beliefs about activism, and beliefs about the centrality of Christ's crucifixion, alongside those other things.
I laughed at one point while reading your book, because it seemed that you and I had come kind of independently to the same conclusion. I don't know if you did so consciously or not, but the Wesleys mattered a lot more than I previously thought. I mean, not that I ever thought that John and Charles Wesley were insignificant, but there really was something extraordinary happening at that time. And you seem to bring that out quite a bit in the book.
Yeah, no, I think that what I bring to this discussion, at least sort of for our people, our community, whoever they are, is that most people in our circles, I think, are more familiar with, if they're familiar with history at all, it's American history and the history of American evangelicalism. I actually come to it from my study and my doctoral studies of British evangelicalism. So going all the way back to my dissertation on Hannah More, the abolitionist and evangelical that I wrote a book about a few years ago. I mean, that's how I encountered what evangelicalism was then, and discovered the Wesleys and their significance. And so I think it's just a little bit of a blind spot that we have as Americans, that we just tend to focus on the American history of evangelicalism. But the Wesleys were really important, and the Wesleys were abolitionists, and they were sort of renegades, and they are a whole other stream of evangelicalism that I think that we've neglected.
And one of the things that you talk about quite a bit in this book, and I agree with you completely, is about the significance and importance of metaphors and the way they sort of subconsciously work their way through us and change the way that we see everything. What sorts of metaphors would you say are kind of unconsciously accepted by the church right now and used by the church in ways that might be have changed us?
All of my chapters are devoted to different ones, but they tend to be those that are more historical. The one that I think that I cover in the book, and then maybe I'll cover one that I don't mention in the book that your question prompts, is empire, which is a really big topic. And you know, of course, part of my premise in the book is that all language is metaphorical, right? So even something that we can say is actually literally true and good, like conversion, that is biblical and we must be converted. There are layers to that word that are metaphorical, and so they all sort of go together, so that even when we're thinking about what we mean by literal conversion, there's an effect that the metaphors have on how we think of that. In the case of empire, you know, I come to this party kind of late because I know lots of other thinkers and writers and historians and sociologists have talked about these things, but coming from the inside and looking at it a little bit more from the outside, in researching this book, I did not really put together how connected 19th century colonialism by the British Empire, which was brought about by evangelicalism, is rooted in our thinking about empire and control and power today. And that in many ways, the empires of the mega churches and the publishing industry, I mean, you know, you and I are part of it. I'm not putting it all down. But these empires that have come to define contemporary evangelicalism, you know, they're not just products of, you know, late 19th century and early 20th century entrepreneurship. They actually go all the way back to the empires that were built by the British in Europe and across Europe and in Africa, in America. And they are our heritage. And we might not conquer lands still today as evangelical Christians, but we sure try to conquer Twitter and conferences and people and institutions. And that's just part of our DNA.
Do you think there's significance to the language of crusades, Billy Graham's Crusades, Campus Crusade for Christ? Was that simply a chosen metaphor, or do you think it was coming out of that impulse?
I think it was coming out of that impulse. And those are words that, you know, they have one meaning when we study the Crusades in medieval Europe, and that meaning we sort of today recognize as bad. But then we think of it in a different way with a crusade, like a Billy Graham crusade. We do have a different association with it, but those associations really can't be separated. And so that's why I point out those examples. I don't think anyone in, you know, the middle of the 20th century, when they were picking a name, I don't think they were thinking, well, let's name this after, you know, the plunder that the medieval Christians did. But those words carry throughout our language, and even as they shift in meaning, they still carry that history with them. And it's not coincidental that we would use militaristic language like that to talk about our evangelistic efforts. Metaphors matter. That's kind of the point.
You go through a whole series of metaphors and story-making vehicles. And one of the chapters that I found particularly helpful was the section on testimony. And I just couldn't help but think of, I remember telling my grandmother one time when I was about to give my testimony to Congress about climate change or something. And I said, you know, pray for me. I'm giving my testimony tomorrow in the House or the Senate. Public Works Committee. And she said, just remember this. Tell them my life before I met Jesus, how I met Jesus, my life after I've met Jesus, and that will cover everything. And I just said, okay, but I don't think we're thinking of testimony exactly the same way right now. But you talk about in this book about the necessity of heart change and storytelling and narrative in the way we think. Do you think that's still the case? In most congregations, there's not the same sort of time that I think there would have been earlier in American history where people stand up and actually give a testimony, or has it just shifted to other ways?
That's a really good question. And again, I'm old enough that I went to churches where we did stand up and give testimonies or praises or whatever. And we may not do that as much anymore. But we still, there's an expectation that we're going to do that in our relationships or our friendships or in our evangelistic efforts, or there's an expectation even with one another, have a story like that. And that's kind of the point that I'm making, is that as human beings, and you point this out in your book, you have a great line in there about how, we are really driven more first by narrative before worldview. And that's really what I'm unpacking in my book. We are story-driven creatures. And so we exist and think and live and process through stories. And we love dramatic stories. I mean, I'm a literature professor. I love drama, right? So, but we don't often enough or intentionally enough think about how our natural immersion in stories and love for dramatic stories does not necessarily mean that our own most important story, our conversion story, needs to follow a certain formula, must follow a certain formula, must be dramatic in order to be legitimate. Those are sort of often assumed messages or implied messages or unexamined assumptions that can alter what we believe about our own salvation or other people's testimonies, because we carry this expectation that this formula is supposed to fit. And while it often does, it doesn't always, and it doesn't have to. And we can give glory to God in the most mundane and ordinary of testimonies, whether they're given before Congress, or, to a family member or a friend.
I highlighted and put amen in my copy of the book when you talked about the irony of that sort of felt need for a dramatic conversion story and the emphasis on child conversion. I remember one time I was talking to a mutual friend of ours, and a whole group of us were there, and I said, it's really common. My experience, I know many people who've done this, who've prayed the sinner's prayer over and over and over again, just in case there wasn't enough sincerity the time before. And it can really be a tyranny over one's life. There's something that's really good about the dramatic conversion story in order to say, hey, anybody can be received by Christ. Doesn't matter how far gone, but without making that the default. Do you think there's a way to do that?
Well, I do. I mean, I think that, and I talk about this in the book, and I think my publisher made a little meme about it, which is why it's on my mind. But if, the Christian life should be full of testimonies, right? When we say, share our testimony, it's shorthand for our salvation testimony, and that's fine. But even using that shorthand takes the focus off the testimony of how God works in our lives in every day and in the most mundane and ordinary ways. And there's drama in that. There is drama in the way that God has orchestrated my life, the way he orchestrates my schedule. Sometimes I just think, when a meeting gets canceled and something else happens, I just feel like the Lord did that. Now, I don't go around talking about that because people, I don't know, it's boring, or they would think I was weird. But if we are really in tune with, or just close to the Lord, and we see him working with us in our lives every day at this intimate, ordinary, everyday level, to me, that's really dramatic. And it will show up in our lives. So I think what's replaced, we offer the evidence of our salvation through these stories, when in fact the evidence of our salvation should be more known through the fruit of the Spirit. And we have a lot of people out there, in the churches, in the pews, on the internet, giving dramatic salvation testimonies. But I see a lot who do not evidence the fruit of the Spirit. And that is the most powerful testimony. So it's taking the whole of Scripture and the whole of what salvation means, not in a moment, but over the course of our lives. That really is dramatic. And maybe we're just not that good at sharing stories in that way because we're just not very good storytellers and we don't read a lot of stories, but that's another matter.
You mentioned in the book that there's been a shift in the social imaginary when it comes to even what testimonies are about, the testimony of improvement, and even now the testimony of disillusionment. What's the shift, and where did that come from?
Yeah, it was interesting because it was something that I observed and sort of something I sort of felt and knew, and then I just stumbled across, a study showing this, that, and most of us know this. I mean, we've gone from a culture more broadly in which we want evidence that demands a verdict, and we want instead evidence that shows the authenticity and the believability or credibility of the person giving the evidence. You even had a line like that in your book that I noted, because it was like we were writing the same thing. You talk about how Jesus had personal credibility. And that's what people are looking for with us. Do we really? And you've expressed this a number of ways in your writing and your speaking. Do we really believe what we say we believe? When we don't live lives that demonstrate that, then our testimony isn't credible. And people aren't looking for scientific evidence necessarily, or as often as they did in mid-modernity. They're looking for whether or not we really live like we believe what we say we do.
Do you think that the rise of social media, the way that we have it, has changed that? I mean, there are all kinds of people that I can't imagine having a hearing in previous generations, when what was expected is either not just necessarily some kind of holiness, but even in more carnal ways, some sort of building of something. This person built a great church or whatever. And now it seems to be who can say the most outrageous things. Did social media just kind of let us peer into that, or has it changed?
Yes. I mean, again, I think there are at least two things going on here. And one thing that does give me more hope and perspective when I think about the worst elements of social media, and I do think about that a lot, believe me, is that, there was a similar thing that happened during the rise of print culture. And, when the printing press developed, first it was like, oh, well, let's print the Bible. And that was wonderful. And people could read the Bible for themselves. That changed the world. But also, like, women and vagabonds began writing and printing things, like people who didn't know much or weren't educated, or people who would lie and deceive. And there was a lot of that going on. And that's actually why, what prompted John Milton to write his famous tract Areopagitica, where he was arguing against his own Puritan government as a Puritan, requiring licensing for anything to be printed. So these tensions existed before, when all of a sudden the floodgates were open for anyone, or at least more people to print things and say things who didn't have the kind of authority that the gatekeepers had before. And so we're living in a similar moment, but it's just like it's times 10 or times 100 or times 1,000. And if we look back at early print, readers and people had to learn how to use that new technology and that new information. Like, they had to learn that Gulliver's Travels was satire. It wasn't true, right? And so I do think we're in a moment where we are learning how to use digital media, and people, those who are abusing it, I know I'm too optimistic. Those who are abusing it, I think, may eventually fall by the wayside. I mean, it may take a generation or two, but I think that we, just as in print culture, we will eventually see far more blessings and gifts from it, and some of the curses we will figure out and learn to navigate better, I hope.
I don't like John Bunyan. I like the person of John Bunyan. I like the life of John Bunyan, but Pilgrim's Progress leaves me cold, and Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners even more so. And I think because I've seen so many people who started reading some Puritan literature from that time period, who became so morose and so introspective and believing there's no way they could really be a Christian. And all of the tests that they were giving to themselves, then they would test whether or not they had the objectivity to go through the tests, all of that. That Puritan era, I think, brought some things that just really creep me out. But you talk about in the book just how significant Pilgrim's Progress really was in terms of shaping everything around us, which I don't think I'd ever thought about before. I mean, I knew it was at one point the most popular book other than the Bible, but I didn't really think about how the story actually changed the way we see things.
I'm going to be completely honest here. I mean, The Pilgrim's Progress is kind of a drag to read. I mean, as even teaching it, my students love to hate it, and I love to teach it to try to, hate it with them and help them see it. And I'm so glad, actually, that I came to it as a student of literature before, more than a Christian. I mean, I was a Christian, but I approached it as literature. He luxuriated in his imagination. He let it sort of influence him and lead him to the Lord, to the source of that imagination. And so, 17th century literature is tough.
You had a line that just blew me away because it resonates so much with me, in which you said, talking about Bunyan, unbeknownst to him, Bunyan's imagination was being refashioned until that time when it was ready to conform to the gospel. And the reason that struck me is I have seen that so many times with people, and I've seen it with myself, where there are things that are sort of kind of approaching hoofbeats. You don't really know what's happening, but there's a slow change that then in the fullness of time grows to something else. That really is a powerful insight, and I think a lot of people are closer to a mind change, whether a conversion in the Christian sense or just a mind change about something, than people think, because it's all internal and often God's doing something. I mean, that's just a really important insight, I think, in having the imagination to look into what might be going on in other people's lives.
No, I'm glad you picked up on that because, again, as moderns, and evangelicalism is a product of modernity, we live in modernity, even if it's late modernity, we just, again, tend to emphasize the rational mind and the evidence and whether or not the Bible is scientifically true. And all those are good and interesting questions. But as moderns, we have failed to take enough account of aesthetic experience, the imagination, the heart, all of those things. I mean, many more thinkers and writers are addressing those now, and this book is part of that. But that's where we are in this moment as we're seeing the limits of modernity. I think that's also why we're coming up against the limits of the evangelical movement too, because it is so rooted in modernity, which again, it's wonderful. I'm so thankful for so many gifts of modernity, but it's not everything. And that we need to see what it's missing. And an emphasis on the imagination and aesthetic experience and the body is part of what's been missing.
Do you think one of the reasons that imagination and at least conscious metaphor, that these things are so suspect to some evangelicals, is the way that they were used by, for instance, modernist mainline Protestants in the 19th and 20th centuries. To resurrection is a beautiful metaphor of what's happening in one's heart. And so somebody can get up and preach the resurrection, but really they're just talking about existential experience. I think there are some people who, if they even start to engage at the level of imagination, start to think, oh, wait, that means that I'm no longer going to have a literal sense of what's really true. Do you think there's some people who have that's the obstacle they face?
I think it is, and I touch on this a little bit in my chapter on rapture, where I talk about the rise of sort of the literal interpretation of the Bible, which was in the 19th century. And I think the sort of mainline liberal Protestants that you were referring to in the 1950s might see the resurrection, I guess, or today too, might see the resurrection as a metaphor. They're responding in a counter swing to that literalism of the 19th century. They're going in one direction, but we've gone again in the opposite direction. And I think the truth is more in the middle. I mean, what do we even mean by taking the Bible literally? If Adam knew Eve, as the Bible says, like, which literal definition of knew are we going with, right? I mean, so again, it's just human for us to respond to an excess in one direction with an excess in the opposite direction. And so I think when we're talking about language in the Bible and our understanding of what the Bible is teaching us and our faith, we need to recognize, as I said in the book, that all language is metaphorical in some sense, and so then start looking at the layers of meaning and how those meanings accumulate, and something can be literally true and metaphorically true. And I think that the most important teachings of Christianity are exactly that. Christ literally rose from the dead, and he did that so that we can metaphorically, in this life, conquer death too, and then through him literally as well.
What would you say to the person who, I mean, I've seen this a lot of people who, for instance, trying to teach the Bible, they don't know how to deal with parable or paradox or Psalms. They know how to deal with Pauline epistles and kind of translate everything into that. And sometimes I will have someone who will say, sometimes it's a future preacher, sometimes it's somebody who's a parent and trying to disciple kids or whatever, who says, I don't have a well-shaped imagination, and I feel like I'm kind of too late to do that. So what would you recommend to that person?
Well, it's never too late. And I mean, there is such a rich array of resources now talking about reading the Bible as a literary text. So again, we can come at it from opposite directions. We can begin with reading the Bible in that way, or with, like me, I mean, I just read a lot of literature in my life. So then when I approached the Bible, I kind of brought that knowledge with me. But if people are just, they're centered on or wanting to understand the Bible as literature, just one name that comes, Leland Ryken. I mean, he's got his own library of short and long and deep and wide books, focused and broad, that elucidate how the Bible works as a literary text and covers so many genres. You could read him alone for a long time and receive a college education in his books. But then another approach is simply to read more literature, to read some poetry, to read short stories, to read novels, and to read them intentionally. Reading can be entertaining and fun, but there's also a kind of reading that, good literature does require us to think and engage and with the text. I mean, I like to compare it to going to a museum. If you go to a museum and look at paintings, you don't race by and glance at them. You stop and you look and you just notice. And you don't even have to be schooled or trained in art to just be able to look at it and notice it and think about how it, what it's emphasizing and what the brush strokes and the lights, what they're all doing. And when we read a literary text, the Bible or not the Bible, those are things that we want to think about. How does language work in this situation? How is this story having this effect? What does this word mean? Why is this word or this phrase so jarring? We are creatures of language. We are people of the book. Jesus is the word. We are supposed to think about language, use language, recognize its power, and steward it well in our lives. And there are so many ways to do that with the Bible and with other words.
Would you say to someone, I know what my answer usually is, but I wonder if you would agree with me, and I think you might not, because I will sometimes say if somebody's trying to experience fiction or poetry or something for the first time, maybe an author for the first time, my advice is, okay, I love Flannery O'Connor. If you don't, if it's not your thing, close Flannery O'Connor and read somebody else and move to somebody else. Not every author speaks to everybody, but I know that there's an argument that could be made to say no. If you stick with the text and you do the work, then you're actually going to get the benefit from it. Well, which of those is the best approach?
Russell, yours is.
Oh, really?
Yours is the best. Yes, it is. Because there's so much good literature out there. Like, why stick with something that just isn't your cup of tea or you don't get or it doesn't get you when there's so much more out there? There's so much good literature. I haven't read a tiny fraction of it. Now, good literature does make a demand on us. So we are going to have to at some point stick with it. It's not the same thing as reading an email or reading Twitter or reading Facebook, but certainly it should be something that pulls us, draws us, that, at least is a topic that interests us or a style. Flannery O'Connor is not everyone's cup of tea, and I would never force Flannery O'Connor on anyone except for my college sophomores.
I was blown away because I never knew this. I've been familiar with Thomas Kinkade all my life, I think. But I never knew this almost Flannery O'Connor-like story about the painter of light, Thomas Kinkade. And as I was reading your talking through that, I was thinking to myself, wow, what a metaphor and parable even this is for what we've seen over the past several years. Tell listeners what the life of Thomas Kinkade, and maybe for those who've never seen Thomas Kinkade, explain what it is and why Christians tend to like it.
All right. Well, if you do know Thomas Kinkade, and not very much, then what you know is that he is called the painter of light. And even if you don't know him, when I describe him, you will know. Because you can get greeting cards and calendars and all these things. So his paintings tend to be of cozy cottages with a well-lit window and little gardens outside and bridges, and they're very cozy, and at some point are suffused with light or surrounded by light. And his products are everywhere, stores, different iterations of his paintings and so forth. And people find his work very comforting, and which is really the point, very sentimental. That's just where the chapter where I begin talking about him is on sentimentality. But what a lot of people don't know is that Kinkade started out as a very talented painter, and that you can find some of his early work online, and I think you can still find it, and it's a very different style. It's not totally different, but it's more artistic, less commercial, shows a lot of talent. But eventually he fell into making a lot of money through creating these sentimental works of art that were, produced basically in a factory by hundreds of workers in a kind of assembly line, and sold a lot. And then eventually it was in his late 40s or 50s. He just ended up, having some trouble with the law, being accused of sexual harassment, being arrested for public urination while drunk, whatever that charge is, and he died. And it's a very sad story, but the metaphor that you just alluded to, and the reason why I talk about it, because I'm criticizing sentimental art, but I'm also trying to make the point that an overly sentimental faith, an overly sentimental life or outlook is a lie. And you can only live a lie or believe a lie for so long before it kind of comes out of the other side. It's like a balloon. If you squeeze it too hard on one end, it will burst on the other end. And that's exactly what we see in evangelicalism in many areas, and in the Victorian age, where I kind of center it. The Victorian age, which was known for its family values, for its elevation of women, for its thrift and duty, also had an extremely high prostitution rate in London, because you just can't keep up that facade for very long without it kind of coming out the other side. And so one extreme will eventually lead to another extreme, which is why balance and honesty and truth and goodness and beauty are so important.
As I'm thinking about Kinkade, and you mentioned later on about, I think it was Jerry Falwell, to whom you were a senior, about the irony of being a word-based people but having a team of ghostwriters, which was certainly not exclusive to him, and nor is it now in a lot of cases. But when you think about that sentimentality and the way that it has led us in these directions, I mean, how do we come back from that without squeezing the balloon on the other side? There was a time when I thought the problem with evangelical Christianity is too much of a focus on subjective experience without rooted theology. And then I looked at a lot of the places that were recovering theology and intellect and rootedness, and in the fullness of time saw all the same problems except angrier, and in ways that often seemed very dead and spiritually cold. So how do we get that balance when it comes to that?
That is the question, and this is what virtue is, which is a kind of side hobby of my, virtue ethics. Virtue is that moderation between an excess and a deficiency, right? It's just finding that golden mean between those two polar opposites, and the virtuous person does this in all areas and with all attributes and in all situations, and none of us, Jesus did that. I mean, if you think of what the cross is, structurally the form of the cross is exactly that, right? Like we use that expression, like the crux or the crux of the matter. Jesus was like literally and metaphorically in the center, which is what virtue is. And it is just, goes against our human nature to do that. It's so much easier to go to an extreme and to overcorrect. And by the way, I always teach this to my students when I talk about virtue and human history, which is a history of pendulum swings from one extreme to another. The most common cause of fatal car accidents in young people, for a time anyway, I don't know if that's changed since the pandemic, but is overcorrection. Like if your car starts to go off the road, it's the overcorrection that causes the fatality. And that's such a perfect metaphor for our human nature, because we, the Protestant Reformation, which I love, I'm Protestant, right? Was a correction of the abuses and excesses of the church, and that's the history we have that does minimize the imagination and minimize aesthetic experience. But if we overcorrect, then we're missing something, and so we just have to constantly look for it and fight against it in our individual lives, but also in our communities, our churches, and our in our movements. This is a movement that's 300 years long, and it has some excesses, and they need to be corrected. Whether it's too late to or not, I don't know, but as long as we're in it and able, we should be trying to correct them.
You and I have seen a lot over the past several years and experienced a lot over the past several years. And sometimes I will imagine telling my younger self some things that I've learned or seen, just to imagine how that would be received in that naive sort of state. If you were talking to Karen Swallow Prior of, say, 10 years ago, what would you tell her?
I would tell the Karen Swallow Prior of a year ago not to trust in man so much. I mean, humans so much. I can be a little Pollyanna and naive, I guess, and a little too optimistic, as I said before. Of 10 years ago, I love this. Actually, I'm going to cheat, and you said something in your book that I put a star by. And this really resonated with me. You were at a church, I guess, and somebody came up to you and said, one day you will see that it's really about power and career advancement and opportunism. You think that these people are a community for you, but you will find that the second you are no longer useful to them, they will do the same thing to you that they are now doing to us.
Yeah.
And if someone had said that to me 10 years ago, I wouldn't have believed them. And I would tell myself 10 years ago, at least consider it.
Yeah, and how would you advise somebody who maybe didn't have the backgrounds that you and I had in different ways? I think your really good childhood situation prepared you, and my crisis time in adolescence, I think, prepared me. That neither of us lost the faith with some of the things we've seen. But what about that 22-year-old who is saying, I look around at all of this anger and hatred and division within evangelical Christianity, and who needs it? Who needs it? What would you advise that person?
I would tell that person it's so cliche, and it's kind of how I close my book, but it's, look to Jesus, right? Just follow Jesus. I want to tell this slightly funny anecdote. Recently, I saw someone tweet that, and I'm paraphrasing here, saying, follow the way of Jesus is just code for liberal progressive Christianity.
Oh,
and I saw that tweet, and I thought, oh, that's really funny satire. And then I went and I looked at the feed, and it wasn't satire. And that was actually that's like a little benchmark for me, because I realize now that there are people who are literally saying that to follow Jesus is not Christianity. That's what they're saying. And so I would of course, I would go into it deeper. I would say it's not just Jesus and me, because that's been part of the problem, right? So look to Jesus, follow Jesus, and listen to what Jesus says about community and the church. But you have to start with him and end with him. And I also, again, the historical perspective helps me. I mean, the church has been through this fracturing before, and I do believe that this fracturing we're going through right now is going to lead to something more beautiful, and more biblical and more holy and more Christ-like. I don't know if I will live to see the end of it, but I just want to be found faithful at the end, whatever that might be, for the next generations. And so I would tell those young people to look to Jesus and to look to those who are like him. And the rest is just this historical moment, this cultural crisis that we're in. And others have been through worse ones, and others will be through ones worse than ours. It's just the moment that we're in. But Jesus remains the same yesterday, today, and forever.
I would say amen to that, with only one revision, which is to say sometimes it can feel like just Jesus and me for a little while. And if that's somebody in that situation, that's happened before. I mean, Elijah thought he was alone, and there was a community waiting for him. So don't give up.
I accept that revision. A+. I think that's right. That's a good reminder.
The book is called The Evangelical Imagination: How Stories, Images, and Metaphors Created a Culture in Crisis. This is a really good book, and it will help you see and understand all kinds of things going on around you. We did not even get into a little bit of what all you will find in this book, so I encourage you to get a copy of it. Karen Swallow Prior, it's always good and thought-provoking to talk to you. Thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for having me.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosper. Hosted by Russell Moore, produced by Ashley Hales. Associate producers are Abby Perry and Azare Phelps. CT administration provided by Christine Kolb. Social media by Kate Lucky. Director of Operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens. Audio engineering provided by Dan Phelps. Video producer is Abby Egan. And the theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.